George Washington was not the first president of the United States. There were 18 presidents before him. Now, they're smaller terms, and they were fighting the American Revolution, and it's slightly different than the current presidency since it was under the Articles of Confederation and the terms of the Continental Congress, but he wasn't the first president. So look at them all. You have 8 of the first president of the Continental Congress. You have 8 of them from 74 to 81. Peyton Randolph, Henry Middleton, and then Peyton Randolph again, John Hancock, Charles Thomson, Henry Laurens, John Jay, and Samuel Huntington. So there's 8. And then after the Articles of Confederation had been passed, these are the ones who were presidents. And they're called Presidents of the United States in Congress assembled. You had Samuel Huntington, who was seated, but he wasn't the one that was elected. Thomas McKean would be the one who was elected and kept the position. Then you have John Hanson, Elias Boudinot, Thomas Mifflin, Richard Henry Lee, John Hancock, Nathaniel Gorham, Arthur St. Clair, and Cyrus Griffin. So there's 18 presidents before George Washington, before the U.S. Constitution, modern day presidency. He wasn't the first president, and this is a very unanalyzed part of our nation's history. But let's take a look at it. Here's some information, just a little bit, okay? So the first president of the United States, the first president of the First Continental Congress of the United States was Peyton Randolph. Peyton Randolph of Virginia, and he was elected September 5th, 1774. He served for 1 month, and then he resigned due to poor health, preventing President Peyton Randolph from attending the last few days of the session. And then Henry Middleton of South Carolina was elected to replace him. So Peyton Randolph is the first president of the United States, and then Henry Middleton would be the second one. When the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10th, 1775, Peyton Randolph again was chosen as president, but he returned to Virginia 2 weeks later to preside over the House of Burgesses. Middleton declined to serve in the office again, and so John Hancock, the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, was elected to the post. John Hancock presided over Congress for more than 2 years before returning to Massachusetts. So John Hancock is the president of the Continental Congress when George Washington was selected as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on June 19th, 1775. So why was George Washington chosen as Commander-in-Chief? Because President John Hancock and the Continental Congress picked him to do so. John Hancock also was the one who was residing as the president when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And that's what John Hancock is known for his large, big, bold signature on the Declaration of Independence. But it was created, it was formed, and it was signed during John Hancock's presidency, when he was president of the Continental Congress of the United States in 1776. Henry Laurens of South Carolina was elected in November 1777. During Laurens' presidency, Congress became embroiled in a bitter dispute over the activities of the diplomat Silas Deane. Laurens, a critic of Deane, resigned in protest during the affair. Laurens hoped that Congress would re-elect him and vindicate his actions, but in an election held December 1778, only 4 states voted for him. 8 states voted for John Jay, who became the next president of the United States. There were only 12 votes because 1 state didn't have any delegates in attendance at the time. During his presidency, John Jay, who was also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, served as Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. When John Jay left the presidency to serve as minister to Spain, Samuel Huntington of Connecticut was elected as president September 28th, 1779. Samuel Huntington had health problems, including contracting smallpox in 1780, and so he asked to be replaced in July 1781. By this time, the Articles of Confederation had been ratified. The Articles of Confederation were ratified on March 1st, 1781. July 9th, 1781, Samuel Johnston became the first man to be elected as president of Congress after the ratification of the Articles. So there was a chair at the time, when it was. So Samuel Huntington was the president when the Articles of Confederation was passed, but Samuel Johnson was the first man to be elected according to the Articles of Confederation but he declined the office, citing pressing family matters. So after Samuel Johnston turned down the office, then you have Thomas McKean, who was elected July 10th, 1781. Although McKean was a delegate from Delaware, he was also serving at the time as Chief Justice of Pennsylvania. His dual role as President of Congress and Chief Justice of Pennsylvania provoked some criticism that McKean had become too powerful. Why would they be complaining about him being too powerful? Because he's the president. He's the president of the Continental Congress of the United States, the governing body of the United States. On November 5th, 1781, John Hanson of Maryland was elected, and then John Hanson would become the first president of Congress to serve a full one-year term as specified under the Articles of Confederation. There's some folks that argue that John Hanson was the first president, and if you've ever heard of the theory that's been floated out that the first president of the United States was black, John Hanson is the person that they say was the first black man. Personally, I don't believe it, but I don't know. I mean, there's some, I don't know. So, but if you've heard that that theory, then it's John Hanson that we're talking about. John Hanson is followed by Elias Boudinot, who won the office in a comparatively narrow election, receiving the votes of just 7 states. So there weren't enough delegates to choose St. Clair's successor until January 22nd, 1788, when the final president of Congress, Cyrus Griffin, fucking shit. Not enough delegates present to choose St. Clair's successor until January 22nd, 1788, when the final president of Congress, Cyrus Griffin, was elected. Cyrus Griffin resigned his office on November 15th, 1788, after only 2 delegates showed up for the new session of Congress. The last president of the Continental Congress was Cyrus Griffin, who resigned November 1788. Now, this time period is comparatively understudied and underanalyzed. When I think about when the Revolution first began, actually ask any American, when did the Revolution begin? When did it begin? Because, you know, there's some debate. George Washington, he didn't care about the Boston Massacre. He didn't care about the Boston Tea Party. In fact, he was against the Boston Tea Party. He was like, them damn, rascals, damn rapscallions are damaging property. And he didn't really care, maybe the shot at Lexington and Concord, but that's all in Massachusetts. He's in Virginia. He's like, what are these colonies doing, up to the north? It wasn't until Lord Dunmore had threatened to take away the slaves before George Washington said, okay, enough is enough. You're not going to take away my damn slaves. And then he jumps into the foray. So there could be some argument that says that when Peyton Randolph was elected to the Continental Congress, which is self-governing, when the Americans started governing ourselves, when Peyton Randolph was elected September 5th, 1774, that would be the beginning of the American Revolution, when Peyton Randolph was elected. There was fighting that was going on in Massachusetts, 1774. So, I used to think it was the Declaration of Independence, but that was, after several presidents had already been president of the Continental Congress, and that was John Hancock. John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress at the time. So the American Revolution is fought, 1774 to 1783. The Battle of Yorktown is 81, but then there's a whole bunch of other battles, but 1783 is when the Treaty of Paris is signed. Well, George Washington becomes president in 1789. So what's happening during all these years? From 1774 to 1783, the Continental Congress, right, it's a war sort of body. It's the legislative executive branch for the war body. But then once the war is over, George Washington doesn't become president until 1789. So what happens between 1783 to 1789? So there's a lot to look at here. We should analyze this. We should, it's understudied and underanalyzed, and this is what makes us Americans. And so we should know about this. We should understand how it is we became our country. How did we become the United States of America? Some folks will also make the argument that the previous president isn't the same president as the United States one. And there's notable differences. The U.S. presidency currently is purely executive. There's no administrative duties, whereas the old president was more like a chair, the one who was non-biased and tried to get the whole, conversation going. But they had executive duties, but they had a lot of administrative duties, whereas the current presidency doesn't have much administrative duties, but a lot of executive duties. They're also the commander-in-chief. So whereas John Hancock had selected George Washington to be the commander-in-chief, right now the president is the commander-in-chief. They're one and the same, is the exact same position. So some people will try to say that it's the exact same position, while other people will say, oh, none of that matters. And it's usually, in between. And it is in between. It wasn't an irrelevant position unless you want to say that the American Revolutionary War was irrelevant, or the Declaration of Independence was irrelevant, and they weren't irrelevant. This also goes to democracy and how it is that we choose who governs us and who rules over us. So I think this is all important when it comes to the conversation of who it is that we are as Americans. So the Continental Congress wasn't irrelevant. They prosecuted the American Revolution. They chose the commander-in-chief. They signed the Declaration of Independence and made, lots of decisions during that time. So, and also I want you to think about how all this went down. You have a Continental Congress, and then you're going to have Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 87. This is where ex-revolutionary soldiers, they fought, right, in the American Revolutionary War, but then they were losing their land. So they put their lives on the line. They fought for this country, and then once they got back, because of taxation, the high taxes, they were losing their land. The bank was coming over and taking all their lands in spite of them fighting for the country. So after Shays' Rebellion, a lot of the aristocracy wanted a stronger centralized government to put down all the rebellions, justly or not, like Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion is just like what the American Revolution was all about. We have the current U.S. Constitution today because of Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion was mostly fought in Massachusetts, and it was fought by the American Revolutionary soldiers who were fighting because of taxation without representation. It's quite ironic. That's ironic indeed. It's even more ironic when you find out that George Washington comes out of retirement to fight against these American Revolutionary soldiers, to fight against those in Shays' Rebellion. And because of Shays' Rebellion, the aristocracy changes their document, their governing charter, their constitution, from the Articles of the Confederation to the current U.S. Constitution. So Shays' Rebellion fundamentally alters the course of American history. So the governing aristocratic elite didn't want these, rebellions popping off at any time, and because the national government is ineffectual, people weren't going to, respect the Continental Congress anymore. So because they wanted more power, because they wanted a centralized government, because they wanted to, have nobody fighting in Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is also, this is Thomas Jefferson, he says that every 20 years, the blood of patriots, the revolution, should be paid for with the blood of tyrants and patriots. The exact quote of Thomas Jefferson is that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And partially it starts out, let's see, we have had 13 states independent for 11 years, and there has only been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. I I hope in God this article will be rectified before the new Constitution is accepted. That's Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. Every 20 years. Thomas Jefferson says the revolution needs to be fought every 20 years. So Thomas Jefferson was totally in favor of Shays' Rebellion. Thomas Jefferson was also kind of pissed off because he was away in Europe when Shays' Rebellion and then the Constitutional Convention happens. And the Constitutional Convention is where they, so they wrote the U.S. Constitution without Thomas Jefferson even being there. And the Constitutional Convention was chaired by George Washington. So, if the chair doesn't mean anything, then he doesn't mean anything either. But he chaired it, and then in 1787, but he wrote just a year before then, 1786, he was writing a letter to Lafayette, the Marquis, the French general who helped fight the American Revolution. George Washington wrote that all of mankind needs to be governed by an elite. Georgie, he says, and I quote, that mankind, under the most favorable circumstances for civil liberty and happiness, are unequal to the task of governing themselves and therefore made for a master. That's exactly what you would expect from a seventh generation slave owning and Native American genociding, fucking psychopath. He's the oppressor, so therefore the people cannot govern themselves unless he's the one governing. Well, he's a human too, right? He's a part of mankind too. So why does he chooses himself to be the main oppressor? Well, this is supposed to be a free country. So he's saying that even though we have the most favorable circumstances for civil liberty and happiness, the mankind is unequal to the task of governing themselves and therefore made for a master. He's an oppressor, an unapologetic oppressor. So let's recap. George Washington wasn't the first president of the United States. The first president of the United States, of the First Continental Congress, was Peyton Randolph of Virginia. Peyton Randolph of Virginia. Samuel Johnston became the first man to be elected as president of Congress after the ratification of the Articles, but he rejected that office. Thomas McKean would be elected, and he would sit as the president of Congress in July 10th of 1781. So he would be the first president elected under the Articles of Confederation. So if there's trivia, who was the first president of the First Continental Congress? Peyton Randolph. Who was the first president after the Articles of Confederation was passed? That would be Thomas McKean. Thomas McKean of Delaware would have been the first president who actually took the seat of the Articles of Confederation. Even though Samuel Johnson was elected, he just didn't take, the office. John Hanson, supposedly perhaps the first black president that some people make the argument of, he would become president after Thomas McKean. And John Hanson of Maryland was the first man to serve his full year as president. So that's what their argument is, that he's the first president because he actually listened to the Articles of Confederation and therefore he served the full presidential term. But that's not 100% accurate. The first president would be Peyton Randolph of Virginia, and then Thomas McKean would have actually been the first president who was elected under the Articles of Confederation. So Peyton Randolph of Virginia, the first president of the United States. Thomas McKean was the first to be elected and to accept the position under the Articles of Confederation, which was passed March 1st, 1781. And then April 30th, 1789, George Washington is seated as president. The 19th president. So, in fact, there's lots of lies about George Washington. Myth-making about George Washington is a huge industry in the United States. George Washington didn't chop down the cherry tree, and he wasn't standing all valiantly on the boat crossing the Delaware River. He didn't have wooden teeth. There's a lot of things that George Washington, that you think you know about George Washington. Since he was the father of the country, well, we got to make George Washington to be bigger and badder than what he actually was. The point of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree was that George Washington could never tell a lie. But he lies out his ass. He's lied so many times. When he ambushed and killed the French diplomat dignitaries in 1754, which eventually starts an international world war, the Fourth French and Indian War, the Fourth Intercolonial War between France and England called the 7 Years' War, he lied. He lied about that. He killed Jumonville in cold blood. They were French diplomats in the woods. He came across them and killed them. And then later on, he goes and builds Fort Necessity, and his brother, Jumonville's brother, captures George Washington, but George Washington signs a statement admitting that he was the one who assassinated Jumonville. So he wrote the thing, and then he says, oh, I didn't know what I was signing. Well, the French word for assassination is assassinat, however you want to pronounce it, but it looks identical to assassination, only without the I-O-N. So he didn't know what assassinat meant. Fuck that. He was a liar. He was a total liar. And eventually, I think even the history books will say that the half-king, Tanacharison, the Lenape, I want to say the Delaware half-king, supposedly he was the one that took a hatchet and buried it into Jumonville's head, and he did it because his father had been boiled and eaten alive by the French. Well, that's a myth. George Washington killed him. George Washington was the one that killed him. George Washington is the one that wrote it on the document, but he was lying, right? It was the Battle of Fort Necessity. He loses, so he's going to lie to try to save his own ass, right? And yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and sign this document and then get the hell out of here. But just look at how the French treated George Washington versus how he had treated them. I mean, how much more respect can you give? Jumonville's brother lets George Washington go. He lets him go. Maybe he shouldn't have, but that's just how, he was showing more respect than what George Washington had showed towards Jumonville. So George Washington is a liar. He also didn't have wooden teeth. He had slave teeth, ivory teeth. He had the Cadillac of dentures back then. And so he's such a good, honorable, and decent man. Yeah, he's paying his slaves so they pull out their own teeth and he can put it in his own mouth. That's not a good man. So he didn't chop down the cherry tree. He told lies. He didn't have wooden teeth. He wasn't standing up when he was crossing the Delaware River. The entire boat would have flipped over. And when he was crossing the Delaware River, that was the same time that Chief Pluggy was actually going into Kentucky. He was going into Kentucky. That's the same day that he was doing that. But you don't know about Chief Pluggy. Plucky Mino T, the Mingo war chief, who was going into Kentucky. You don't know anything about that, even though that was the exact same time as the crossing of the Delaware River. Christmas Day, 1776. You also don't know about Oney Judge, Henry Washington, Hercules, Deborah, and Harvey Squash, Billy Lee. And those are the 5 slaves of George Washington's that we actually know about. He had 318 when he died. How many slaves did he have in his lifetime? How many came and went? How many died underneath his dominion? How many did he rape? He didn't have any children with Martha. And look at Martha. Did he rape? I think that'll be my next video, if wondering, did he rape his own slaves? So let's review the myths, okay? He didn't chop down the cherry tree. He didn't have wooden teeth. He wasn't standing up when he crossed the Delaware River. He didn't write the U.S. Constitution. He wasn't even the first president of the United States. Last thing about the Articles of Confederation, even though it wasn't formally ratified until 1781, March 1st, 1781, that was the governing document that they had. It was drafted by a committee on July 12th, 1776. So that was the document that was governing things from 1776, from the Declaration of Independence on. And then approved version was sent to the states for ratification in late 1777, and then the formal ratification by all 13 states was completed in 1781. All this matters. This is the birth of America, the birth of a nation. And so why did we become America? How did all this happen? Well, it happened because we had 18 presidents that was before George Washington. So, and I'm going to make this one more point again. I'm just going to repeat this last point because I think it's an important point, is just to sort of think about how power works. You have the Continental Congress, the one that had governed everybody in all the states during the American Revolutionary War, and they passed the Articles of Confederation, and then Shays' Rebellion happens, and then they have a separate constitutional convention, and then they, pass the Constitution, it's ratified, and then Washington sits as president in 1789. He becomes, April 30th, 1789 is when he becomes president. Well, if the Continental Congress, they all resigned, if they hadn't have resigned, though, you would have had two national governments competing for the same power. And so, thank goodness that one had resigned. One was more popular than the other. But if I was to just say, hey, I don't like my government of the United States today, so I'm going to go ahead and form my own constitutional convention and start electing delegates and sign my own, document, how would people talk about that? How would it go? How would things unravel after that? Eventually, the one dominated the other, and so the other ones had resigned, but it didn't have to happen that way. Something to think about.